30 men were packed into that briefing room, and every single one of them had heard the same thing the young corporal at the back wall had just said out loud. None of them wanted to be the one who'd said it first. He was 22, a corporal, the lowest rank in a room full of colonels and majors, standing near the back where the map team kept their gear, while a general traced a route across an acetate overlay with one finger and laid out, in that clipped voice everyone in the theater knew, exactly what his army was about to do with the ground in front of it. The corporal had checked the numbers twice in his head before he raised his hand.
"Sir, I don't think that junction is where the map says it is."
The room didn't just go quiet. It went still. The specific stillness of a space where something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Nobody looked at him. The colonels studied the table. The aide standing closest to the general seemed to reconsider every decision that had led him to this exact spot in this exact room. And the general looked up from the map, found the corporal at the back, and said nothing at all. What happened in the next 60 seconds decided whether that young man had just ended his career or made it. And the answer, when it came, wasn't what a single person in that room expected. If you want more untold stories from the Second World War, hit subscribe before we get into it, because this is one of those moments that never made it past a footnote, and it should have. To understand why a corporal risked everything to say 6 words out loud, you have to understand what a staff briefing under this general actually was. It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a room where ideas got workshopped. Information moved up, orders moved down, and rank was the loudest thing in the building. The distance between a corporal and a 3-star general in that room wasn't measured in feet. It was measured in the entire structure of the United States Army. The officers in that room had earned their rank the hard way. Campaigns, judgment calls under fire, years of accumulated professional weight. Some of them had almost certainly looked at that same stretch of overlay and felt the same flicker of doubt the corporal had just voiced, and they had kept it to themselves, because this was a command known for moving fast and expecting the road, the map, and everyone standing near it to keep up. That was the room he raised his hand in. Here's what most people miss about the lightning advances this army became famous for in the second half of 1944. The speed wasn't recklessness. It was built on top of planning that had to be exactly right every single time. A wrong road cost a division hours it didn't have. A misjudged bridge rating could strand armor on the wrong side of a river with the enemy on the other bank. A map error wasn't an academic mistake in a room like this one. It was fuel, time, and eventually lives. And the overlay on that easel that morning had one. The junction in question sat on a road cutting through the edge of a small French town, and it was not where the overlay placed it. That town's road network had been rebuilt in the mid-1930s after severe flood damage, and the cartographic source behind the overlay predated that reconstruction by close to a decade. The real junction sat roughly 1.5 miles from where the map insisted it was, on paper, a small distance. For a mechanized column moving fast through unfamiliar ground, it was the gap between arriving on schedule and arriving 3 hours behind it. Between a coordinated advance and a line of vehicles stacked up on a road that led nowhere near the route they'd been briefed to expect. The corporal, call him Corporal Alan Marsh, 22, out of a steel town in western Pennsylvania, knew this because before the war he'd spent 2 years doing field survey work, and the archive he'd trained on included the exact municipal records of that 1930s reconstruction. This wasn't textbook knowledge. It was the kind of knowledge that only comes from standing on actual ground with a surveyor's transit and a notebook, checking what the map claimed against what the dirt in front of you actually showed, until the gap between those two things becomes the only thing you ever really look for. He'd recognized the error the second Patton's finger crossed that stretch of overlay. He'd run the calculation on whether to say something. He'd waited while a colonel who'd clearly seen the same thing said nothing. He'd waited while a major with direct responsibility for that exact route said nothing. Then he raised his hand anyway. Picture it. 30 officers around a map table, a general's finger tracing a line, and one corporal's hand going up from the back wall. Here's the part that never makes it into the official record. The silence that followed lasted long enough for every person in that room to make their own private calculation about what they were watching and what it was about to cost someone. Some of those colonels had felt exactly the same doubt Marsh had just spoken aloud. They had run the same math and landed on a different answer. not because they lacked the knowledge, but because they understood the room and understood that the room's rules usually outweighed a correction, even a correct one. That calculation, the one that turns accurate information into silence, is something this general understood better than almost anyone else commanding troops in that theater. He'd seen what it produced in other commands. An army where the man with the most rank is always assumed to be right is an army that will eventually drive a column down a road that doesn't exist. And the men who pay for that mistake are never the ones who stayed quiet in the room where it could have been caught. The accounts that survive from that morning agree on the shape of what happened next. Even if the exact words shift slightly, depending on who's telling it, Patton looked at Marsh. Not the look of a man being interrupted, not irritation. He looked at him the way he looked at terrain, reading it, taking its measure before deciding anything. Then he said 2 words, without any of the theater he was famous for. "Show me." Marsh walked from the back wall to the map table, past every colonel and major who'd chosen silence, and stood beside the general at the overlay. He pointed out the junction. He explained the discrepancy, the 1930s reconstruction, the displacement, the exact distance between where the map placed the junction and where it actually sat. He didn't ramble. He said what needed saying and stopped. Patton studied the map while Marsh talked. Not the corporal, the map. The terrain features around the junction, the small cartographic notation in the corner listing the survey date the overlay had been built from. The room didn't make a sound. Then, without raising his voice, without addressing anyone by name, Patton said, "He's right." What the general did in the next several minutes tells you more about how that command actually functioned than any battle history usually bothers to record. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't turn it into a lecture aimed over Marsh's head at the men who'd seen the same error and said nothing. He didn't insist the correction come from someone of appropriate rank before he'd accept it. He simply confirmed it, had the overlay corrected on the spot, and moved the briefing forward. The whole exchange took less than 5 minutes. The next morning, Alan Marsh found out he was a sergeant. No formation, no ceremony. The paperwork had already been signed the night before. His platoon sergeant, a career NCO named Roy Bennett, who'd been standing quietly at the side of the room the entire time, delivered the news with the particular expression of a man who isn't sure yet whether he should be proud, unsettled, or both at once. What was actually being rewarded wasn't map knowledge. Map knowledge is a qualification, useful but not rare. What earned that stripe was something harder to find, the willingness to be right, out loud, in a room full of men who outranked you, at the exact moment when speaking up cost everything and staying silent cost nothing, to you at least. Someone else would have paid for that silence later, in fuel and hours and maybe worse, and never known why. An army built on deference has a reliability problem. When the only information reaching a commanding general has already been filtered through what that general wants to hear, he's no longer navigating real terrain. He's navigating his own assumptions with better lighting. The speed this army became known for across France and into Germany came, in part, from a command culture, built deliberately or by instinct, where accurate information outranked comfortable silence. Alan Marsh went home eventually, finished his surveying certification, took a job with the county engineering department, checking roads and boundary lines the same way he'd checked that overlay, always the ground first, the paper second. He didn't talk about that morning much. When his sergeant told him about the stripe, his first question wasn't about the promotion. It was whether the operational overlay had actually been corrected. Told that it had, he nodded and went back to his maps. So, was Patton right to hand a stripe to a corporal who'd corrected him in front of his entire staff? Some would say no, that rewarding a man for speaking out of turn in a command briefing erodes exactly the kind of discipline an army depends on, that it tells every corporal in the theater that rank is negotiable the moment you think you know better, and no army can run on that signal for long. Others would argue the opposite, that an army which punishes accuracy and rewards deference is the one that eventually follows a confident commander down a road that isn't there, and that putting a stripe on the one man willing to say so, in front of everyone who'd chosen silence, might have been the most important operational decision made in that theater all week. Let us know where you land in the comments. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you're subscribed. There are more of these than you'd think.